Welcome to the fifth video in our series on Friedrich Nietzsche. If you haven't seen the previous videos, it's alright. They all stand alone, dealing with a different subject, and can be understood even without watching the rest. But they are also all part of a project aiming to come at Nietzsche's philosophy from different angles, to give you a complete picture of what it is about. Part of this project is the book I wrote, which you can purchase online. And I also launched another channel in which I intend to do a reading of Nietzsche's books and analyze them. I am currently doing Thus Spake Zarathustra, and if it proves successful, I will do more. If you watch all the videos and read my book, you will gain a pretty comprehensive understanding of his thought. Now, if you follow my Thus Spake Zarathustra series, you probably noticed that Nietzsche is not a big fan of the liberal order that started to prevail in Europe in the middle of the 19th century. Which might bring some of you to wonder, how is it that I, an avowed Nietzschean, am also such a staunch advocate of liberalism? I've been asked this before, and this video will finally attempt to answer. I will try to show that Nietzsche's thought is compatible with liberalism, and that I do not reject its core principles. I just disagree with some of the conclusions that he draws from his thought, and I will claim that what today's liberalism is missing is a dose of Nietzsche. Nietzsche wasn't much of a political thinker. His philosophy focused on how to make the individual better, not how to make society better. Very few of his musings dwelled on political solutions, and he did not formulate any new political system. But what we do have is sufficient to make a clear observation of what he was advocating for. To understand it, however, we first have to understand Nietzsche's ethics. This video, then, will deal with Nietzsche's ethics and politics, and how we can apply them today. Another question I sometimes get asked is why I call myself left-wing, when I am so critical of today's left. The reason is that I identify right-wing with conservatism, with the belief that there are certain values that are eternal and should be conserved. I, on the other hand, believe in constant change, constant rebellion and creating of new ideas and values. This is why Nietzsche's philosophy speaks to me, and why it helped me find my own way. And this is essentially leftist, even if there's a part of the left that falls into rigid ideological thinking, which I oppose more than I oppose conservatism. Now, Nietzsche not only believes in perpetual self-creation, but also anchors it in a complete metaphysics, and creates an ethics to go along with the life of creation. In my book on Nietzsche, and in the third video of this series, I explicated Nietzsche's metaphysics, and as far as I'm aware, I'm the only one who ever did that. In the fourth video, we shifted our attention to his ethics. A good ethics is supposed to do two main things. 1. It should guide you how to live a happy life. 2. It should guide you how to treat others. The fourth video dealt with the first aspect, that of achieving happiness. In this fifth video, we will deal with the question of how to treat others. And, based on that, we will try to understand his political solutions. First, though, if we want to understand Nietzsche's ethics, we'll need to say something about the ethics of the philosopher that had the most profound influence on his development, namely Arthur Schopenhauer. Schopenhauer, also a German, published his main book, The World as Will and Representation, in 1818, but it became influential only in the second half of the century. It had a massive effect on European thought and on the mind of young Nietzsche. The summary I'm about to give is highly simplistic and at times even inaccurate, because we don't have the time to fully understand it, but it'll give us what we need. Schopenhauer philosophized that the universe is made not of matter, but of will. In other words, not something that is moved by outside forces, but something that is self-driven. The will makes up everything that we see and feel. Think of it this way. According to modern science, everything is made of atoms of matter. And yet, when we look at things, we don't see atoms, but objects with a certain shape and color. This is how our consciousness perceives them. Well, imagine that instead of atoms of matter, what you have there is will, and your consciousness, in the same way, perceives this will as objects. We are incapable of seeing the will, but we do have a direct connection with it because we feel it inside ourselves. We are made of it, driven by it, and thus we can feel and understand it. The will is always felt as willing of something. Hunger for food, lust for sex, greed for property, etc. You can satiate these cravings, but while you are busy quenching one, the others are awakened and demand satisfaction. Thus, you are always unsatisfied, and Schopenhauer claims that this means that you are always suffering. Furthermore, this constant will for things leads to conflicts between people, and to further misery and suffering. To end the suffering, we must somehow find a way to transcend the will. There are two ways to transcend the will. One is by meditative contemplation of the world of pure ideas, a world that belongs outside of daily life. This takes you out of the circle of will. The other is through compassion to your fellow humans, which leads to self-negation, to forgetting about your selfish needs and thus transcending the will. This transcendence is only temporary, and the desires always reawaken, but with practice you can achieve long periods of self-negation. The reward is that you don't feel miserable, and don't cause strife and misery to others. Nietzsche was influenced by Schopenhauer's philosophy mainly because it is a philosophy of becoming. That is, a philosophy that believes everything is always in flux, always in the process of becoming something else. It is contrary to the philosophy of being, which believes that there is something in reality that is never changing. A philosopher of being believes that reality is made of objects, and that every object has an essence that remains unchangeable, whereas a philosopher of becoming believes that objects are just something that our consciousness stamps on the ever-changing stream of reality. The romantic, rebellious Nietzsche rejected the philosophies of being, and wanted a philosophy of change and growth. In the philosophy of Schopenhauer, in the idea that we and the world are made of tumultuous will that never ceases to want more, he found a reflection to his own tumultuous spirit. His early writings are heavily influenced by Schopenhauer, but from the start, we can feel the difference. The idea of self-negation, which Schopenhauer regarded as an ideal, was something that Nietzsche rejected with every fiber of his being, and eventually it led him to turn against his master, and against his morality. Nietzsche opens his campaign against contemporary morality in the book Dawn of Day, published in 1881. It is written in aphorisms, each standing on its own and conveying an idea, and it belongs to his critical phase. That is, it is criticizing the beliefs of its time, without trying to present a complete philosophy to replace them. Mostly, every aphorism just tries to show that you can think differently about the discussed subject, but those alternative solutions that he suggests don't add up to any coherent whole, and sometimes contradict each other. The book criticizes many themes, but morality is one of its main targets. The second aphorism states that savants are quite correct in maintaining the proposition that men in all ages believed that they knew what was good and evil, praiseworthy and blamable. But it is a prejudice of the learned to say that we now know it better than any other age. He rejects the idea of the progress of human morality, and claims that we are just as ignorant about good and bad as the people of the past. He also rejects the idea that immorality is rooted in ignorance. The idea, put forth by Socrates, is that people would not knowingly choose to do bad, so if you show them that a certain action leads to bad results, they would refrain from it. The Enlightenment movement was partly driven by the idea that greater knowledge would create a better humanity. But Nietzsche, by this point, already rejected the notions of enlightenment as naive. Those modern philosophers, he argued, judge human nature by the people of their time, and by what they read in history books. But humans are actually the product of millions of years of evolution. Human nature, including our moral sense, is rooted in our animal instincts, and also in the instincts that developed in the years of the prehistoric man, long before the beginning of what we call civilization. We are right to be proud of what we have achieved, but this pride also blinds us to our true nature, which is far from enlightened.
Nothing has been more dearly bought than the minute portion of human reason and feeling of liberty upon which we now pride ourselves. But it is this very pride which makes it almost impossible for us today to be conscious of that enormous lapse of time, preceding the period of world history when morality of custom held the field, and to consider this lapse of time as the real and decisive epoch that established the character of mankind, an epoch when suffering was considered as a virtue, cruelty as a virtue, hypocrisy as a virtue, revenge as a virtue, and the denial of the reason as a virtue, whereas, on the other hand, well-being was regarded as a danger, longing for knowledge as a danger, peace as a danger, compassion as a danger, an epoch when being pitied was looked upon as an insult, work as an insult, madness as a divine attribute, and every kind of change as immoral and pregnant with ruin. You imagine that all this has changed, and that humanity must likewise have changed its character. Oh, ye poor psychologists, learn to know yourselves better.
Note the use of the word psychologists here. Remember that this is before the science of psychology was established, so human psychology was still the field of philosophers and artists. The philosophers of Enlightenment largely ignored human psychology, and focused on human reason, perception, and consciousness. Nietzsche, following Schopenhauer, made psychology a central thing, claiming that our true drives are hidden from our consciousness. He would have a profound effect on the budding field of psychoanalysis. So the belief in the benevolence of human nature is rejected, but, of course, not all thinkers held this belief. Christian thought regarded human nature as sinful, and morality as a code that has to be imposed on this nature to inhibit it. Some Enlightenment philosophers accepted this view, and claimed that human reason is capable of creating such a code. But Nietzsche undermines this belief in the sovereignty and power of reason. One of the recurring arguments is that humans are largely unaware of the processes of our thought. Our decisions are made on the unconscious level, leading to action, and our consciousness then interprets these actions according to its own beliefs. And since most of our beliefs are instilled in us by the society we grow into, we give our actions an interpretation that comes from the mentality of the herd, not from our own individual nature. As a result of all that, we are largely unaware of the causes of our actions, and thus cannot really control them. What can we rely on, then? Perhaps tradition? No. Nietzsche surmises that the traditional laws of morality of every culture were created in an arbitrary way. At some point, a certain action led to a good or bad result. Accordingly, the community then attributed the value of good or bad to that action. In time, what caused this value judgment was forgotten, and it became a fixed law. The culture then gave it an ad hoc explanation, and it became a moral law that everyone must obey, while it has no intrinsic value of good or bad. We are left with that other solution, presented by Schopenhauer and others, to rely on compassion. Schopenhauer portrayed compassion as opposing the selfish drives, and thus as something that can negate them. But Nietzsche argues that compassion is simply one more instinct among others. It can lead to good, but also to bad.
To what extent we must beware of pity? Pity, insofar as it actually gives rise to suffering, and this must be our only point of view here, is a weakness, like every other indulgence in an injurious emotion. It increases suffering throughout the world, and although here and there a certain amount of suffering may be indirectly diminished or removed altogether as a consequence of pity, we must not bring forward these occasional consequences, which are on the whole insignificant, to justify the nature of pity which, as has already been stated, is prejudicial. Supposing that it prevailed, even if only for one day, it would bring humanity to utter ruin. In itself the nature of pity is no better than that of any other craving.
Compassion, says Nietzsche, may be good in preventing some harmful deeds, and thus reduce suffering. But, on the other hand, when we indulge in it and become too compassionate, we become weaker and more vulnerable to suffering, and the overall effect is that the amount of suffering in the world increases. So, if our goal is to reduce suffering, compassion cannot be the basis of our morality. In another aphorism, and here we start to connect to his political views, He talks about how this morality of compassion dominates the 19th century and leads to harmful results for society.
The last echoes of Christianity in morals. On ne bon que per la pitié, il faut donc qu'il y ait quelque pitié dans tous nos sentiments. So says morality nowadays. And how does this come about? The fact that the man who performs social, sympathetic, disinterested, and benevolent actions is now considered as the moral man, this is perhaps the most general effect, the most complete transformation, that Christianity has produced in Europe, perhaps in spite of itself, and not by any means because this was part of its essential doctrine. But this was the residuum of those Christian feelings that prevailed at the time when the contrary and thoroughly selfish faith in the one thing needful, the absolute importance of eternal and personal salvation, together with the dogmas upon which this belief had rested, were gradually receding, and when the auxiliary beliefs in love and love of one's neighbor, harmonizing with the extraordinary practice of charity by the Church, were thereby coming to the front. The more people gradually became separated from the dogmas, the more did they seek some sort of justification for this separation in a cult of the love of humanity, not to fall short in this respect of the Christian ideal, but to excel it if possible, was the secret stimulus of all the French freethinkers from Voltaire to Auguste Comte, and this latter with his famous moral formula vivre pour autrui, has indeed out-Christianized even Christianity. It was Schopenhauer in Germany and John Stuart Mill in England who were the means of bringing into the greatest prominence this doctrine of sympathetic affections and of pity or utility to others as a principle of action, but these men themselves were only echoes. From about the time of the French Revolution these doctrines have manifested themselves in various places with enormous force. Since then they have shown themselves in their coarsest as well as their most subtle form, and all socialistic principles have almost involuntarily taken their stand on the common ground of this doctrine. At the present time there is perhaps no more widely spread prejudice than that of thinking that we know what really and truly constitutes morality. Everyone now seems to learn with satisfaction that society is beginning to adapt the individual to the general needs, and that it is at the same time the happiness and sacrifice of each one to consider himself as a useful member and instrument of the whole. They have still, however, doubts as to the form in which this whole is to be looked for, whether in a state already existing, or in one which has yet to be established, or in a nation, or in an international brotherhood, or in new and small economic communities.
It was Christianity, writes Nietzsche, that made compassion the basis of morality. But Christianity, at least, also emphasized the importance of the individual soul, and it served as a counterbalance. Alas, the idea of the salvation of the soul in the afterlife was rejected by modern thought, without creating a morality suitable for this change. As a result, we still believe that compassion should be the basis for morality, and secular thinkers, even avowed atheists like Schopenhauer, are trying to build their secular morality upon this basis. But without the counterbalance of the importance of the individual, we went further than Christianity, and came to believe that altruism and collectivism should be the basis for our secular morality. And so, we get movements like socialism and utilitarianism, and many other movements that regard the collective as the ideal, trampling on the individual in the process. All individualist and selfish feelings are deemed as bad, and they try to reconstruct the individual to be a useful part of society. As we can already sense, Nietzsche is vehemently opposed to such political movements. What is the alternative, then? Well, as we said, the aim of the book is not to offer alternatives. In a preface he added a few years later, Nietzsche writes that, "In this book we find the subterrestrial at work, digging, mining, undermining." He was searching for answers, not trying to offer any. Not yet. Still, if we look carefully, we can find some beginnings of the path that was later to lead him back to the surface, and then to heights that have rarely been reached. Let's see what he unearthed. One solution can already be extracted from what we have discussed so far. If we agree that the altruistic deeds are no better than selfish deeds, we no longer favor the former over the latter. What will happen then? Nietzsche replies,
In future, then, will these very actions be less frequently performed, since they will be less highly esteemed. Inevitably, or at all events for a fairly long time, as long as the scale of valuations remains under the reacting influence of former mistakes. But we make some return for this by giving back to men their good courage for the carrying out of actions that are now reputed to be selfish, and thus restore their value. We relieve men's bad consciences. And as up to the present egoistic actions have been by far the most frequent, and will be so to all eternity, we free the whole conception of these actions and of life from its evil appearance. This is a very high and important result. When men no longer believe themselves to be evil, they cease to be so.
He admits it will have some bad repercussions, as people will be less prone to altruistic actions. But, on the other hand, people will stop feeling bad about their selfishness. Thus, it will greatly reduce the amount of suffering in the world. Furthermore, people will stop feeling that they are evil for thinking and acting selfishly, and the result, he believes, is that they will become better people. When someone doesn't perceive themselves as evil, they tend to refrain from doing bad. This also has political implications.
Against Rousseau. If it is true that there is something contemptible about our civilization, we have two alternatives of concluding with Rousseau that this despicable civilization is to blame for our bad morality, or to infer, contrary to Rousseau's view, that our good morality is to blame for this contemptible civilization. Our social conceptions of good and evil, weak and effeminate as they are, and their enormous influence over both body and soul, have had the effect of weakening all bodies and souls and of crushing all unprejudiced, independent, and self-reliant men, the real pillars of a strong civilization. Wherever we still find the evil morality today, we see the last crumbling ruins of these pillars. Thus let paradox be opposed by paradox. It is quite impossible for the truth to lie with both sides, and can we say, indeed, that it lies with either? Decide for yourself.
Jean-Jacques Rousseau was one of the Enlightenment philosophers who believed in the benevolent nature of man, and his claim was that the structure of society, with its inequalities and prejudices, is to blame for bad behavior. He also blamed the culture and the arts for corrupting human morality. If we fix the system and fix the culture, man's natural goodness will be allowed to prevail, society will become equal, and immorality will disappear. In contrast, Nietzsche claims that it is exactly this collectivist morality that is the cause of our ills. It represses all great men, those who can create things that we can all benefit from, and reduces them to the mediocre level of the herd. He calls on us to choose. Do we go with Rousseau and continue to demand from everyone to conform to collectivist morality, or do we let individualists, those who have greatness of spirit, do their thing? He also, we see, blames contemporary morality for something else, that it weakened all bodies and souls, and thus made us a weaker species, which suffers as a result. What does he mean by that? Well, let's turn to another aphorism.
The prejudice concerning pure spirit. Wherever the doctrine of pure spirituality has prevailed, its excesses have resulted in the destruction of the tone of the nerves. It taught that the body should be despised, neglected, or tormented, and that, on account of his impulses, man himself should be tortured and regarded with contempt. It gave rise to gloomy, strained, and downcast souls, who, besides, thought they knew the reason of their misery and how it might possibly be relieved. It must be in the body, for it still thrives too well. Such was their conclusion, whilst the fact was that the body, through its agonies, protested time after time against this never-ending mockery.
Again, this goes back to Christianity. Christianity teaches that the soul is a purely spiritual being, which is trapped in a material body. Furthermore, the body is the source of the selfish drives, while the soul is altruistic. This I say then, walk in the Spirit, and ye shall not fulfill the lust of the flesh. For the flesh lusteth against the Spirit, and the Spirit against the flesh, preached St. Paul, and added, Now the works of the flesh are manifest, which are these: adultery, fornication, uncleanliness, lasciviousness, idolatry, witchcraft, hatred, variance, emulations, wrath, strife, seditions, heresies, envyings, murders, drunkenness, revelling, and such like. But the fruit of the Spirit is love, joy, peace, long-suffering, gentleness, goodness, faith, meekness, temperance. To be moral, then, one should repress the body, and this is what Christianity did for 2,000 years. Whenever people behaved badly, Christianity was driven to conclude that the body is not repressed enough, and added further abuse. But actually, says Nietzsche, the soul is part of the body, so the degradation of the body led to the degradation of the soul, and to the sorry state of humanity today. If we no longer believe in God, we should no longer believe that the soul originates in a place other than the body, and we should thus reject the idea of the pure spirit. But modern thinkers keep holding to it, and keep preaching the repression of the body. Thus, humanity continues to suffer. Nietzsche knew all about bodily suffering. He wrote this book while battling a very bad bout of the chronic disease he was suffering from. The disease became for him a metaphor for the state of modern society, and his battle against it a metaphor for his philosophical battle. He writes,
On the knowledge of the sufferer. The state of sick men who have suffered long and terribly from the torture inflicted upon them by their illness, and whose reason has nevertheless not been in any way affected, is not without a certain amount of value in our search for knowledge, quite apart from the intellectual benefits which follow upon every profound solitude and every sudden and justified liberation from duties and habits. The man who suffers severely looks forth with terrible calmness from his state of suffering upon outside things, all those little lying enchantments, by which things are usually surrounded when seen through the eye of a healthy person, have vanished from the sufferer. His own life even lies there before him, stripped of all bloom and color. If by chance it has happened that up to then he has lived in some kind of dangerous fantasy, this extreme disenchantment through pain is the means, and possibly the only means, of extricating him from it. The formidable tension of the intellect that wishes to hold its own against pain shows everything that one now looks upon in a new light, and the inexpressible charm of this new light is often powerful enough to withstand all the seductiveness of suicide and to make the continuation of life seem very desirable to the sufferer. His mind scornfully turns to the warm and comfortable dream world in which the healthy man moves about thoughtlessly, and he thinks with contempt of the noblest and most cherished illusions in which he formerly indulged. He experiences delight in conjuring up this contempt as if from the depths of hell, and thus inflicting the bitterest sufferings upon his soul. It is by this counterpoise that he bears up against physical suffering. He feels that such a counterpoise is now essential. In one terrible moment of clear-sightedness he says to himself, Be for once thine own accuser and hangman, for once regard thy suffering as a punishment which thou hast inflicted on thyself. Enjoy thy superiority as a judge, better still, enjoy thine own will and pleasure, thy tyrannical arbitrariness. Raise thyself above thy life as above thy suffering, and look down into the depth of reason and unreason. Our pride revolts as it never did before. It experiences an incomparable charm in defending life against such a tyrant as suffering and against all the insinuations of this tyrant, who would fain urge us to give evidence against life. We are taking the part of life in the face of this tyrant. In this state of mind we take up a bitter stand against all pessimism in order that it may not appear to be a consequence of our condition, and thus humiliate us as conquered ones.
The illness takes you out of your mindless dwelling in the mundane, and forces you to be aware of yourself and your condition. And what he found was that there is a force within him, which resisted giving in to the disease. He was adamant to keep on living and keep on thinking, and his success in doing so gave him an enormous feeling of pride, a feeling that he describes as incomparable in its joy. Later on, in Thus Spake Zarathustra, this pride will be personified in the form of an eagle that soars and lifts his spirit and his wisdom above any obstacle they run into. But even in Dawn of Day, we can already sense the inkling of a new thought. If this moment of victory over the disease is so joyful, perhaps it should be the basis of a new morality. Perhaps, instead of establishing ethics that focus on reducing suffering for ourselves and others, we should establish ethics that attempt to bring joy to everyone. This book introduces the concept of the feeling of power, a joyful feeling that is achieved mainly by overcoming obstacles. And that leads Nietzsche down a very fruitful path.
The demon of power. Neither necessity nor desire, but the love of power, is the demon of mankind. You may give men everything possible, health, food, shelter, enjoyment, but they are and remain unhappy and capricious, for the demon waits, and must be satisfied. Let everything else be taken away from men, and let this demon be satisfied, and then they will nearly be happy as men and demons can be.
There is something in us, then, that craves power. This isn't a very controversial statement, but Nietzsche claims that this is the strongest craving that we have, and satisfying it leads to the greatest joy. So if you want to establish a morality based on the maximization of happiness, this is the path we should explore.
The effect of happiness. The first effect of happiness is the feeling of power, and this feeling longs to manifest itself, whether towards ourselves or other men, or towards ideas and imaginary beings. Its most common modes of manifestation are making presents, derision, and destruction, all three being due to a common fundamental instinct.
Apparently, it goes both ways. The feeling of power leads to happiness, but happiness also leads to the feeling of power. It is a selfish drive, but it doesn't necessarily drive us to be harmful to others. Nietzsche names several ways in which the feeling of power wants to express itself, some of them destructive, but some generous. So to establish a new morality based on this feeling, Nietzsche will have to formulate an ethics that validates the latter and not the former. This, Dawn of Day doesn't do. What it does do, however, is start to ponder on another question. It points out that in the past, morality was actually established upon selfish drives, but then something happened to change it.
Moral fashions. How moral judgments as a whole have changed. The greatest marvels of the morality of antiquity, such as Epictetus, knew nothing of the glorification, now so common, of the spirit of sacrifice, of living for others. After the fashion of morality now prevailing, we should really call them immoral, for they fought with all their strength for their own ego and against all sympathy for others, especially for the sufferings and moral imperfections of others. Perhaps they would reply to us by saying, if you feel yourselves to be such dull and ugly people, by all means think of others more than yourselves. You will be quite right in doing so.
The great thinkers of the age of antiquity regarded morality as a process of perfecting oneself. They did not show compassion for other people's imperfections, but rather despised them for it. In contemporary morality, these people seem immoral to us. What was it that caused the change? How is it that morality came to be associated with compassion and altruism? This is a question that Nietzsche will have to answer in the future. For now, he already has the beginning of a political solution. We have to re-establish morality on selfish grounds, on the drives that bring joy to people. However, this can only be achieved via a slow, incremental process.
Small doses. If we wish a change to be as deep and radical as possible, we must apply the remedy in minute doses, but unremittingly for long periods. What great action can be performed all at once? Let us therefore be careful not to exchange violently and precipitately the moral conditions with which we are familiar for a new valuation of things. Nay, we may even wish to continue living in the old way for a long time to come, until probably at some very remote period we become aware of the fact that the new valuation has made itself the predominating power within us, and that its minute doses to which we must henceforth become accustomed have set up a new nature within us. We now also begin to understand that the last attempt at a great change of valuations, that which concerned itself with political affairs, the Great Revolution, was nothing more than a pathetic and sanguinary piece of quackery which, by means of sudden crises, was able to inspire a credulous Europe with the hope of a sudden recovery, and has therefore made all political invalids impatient and dangerous up to this very moment.
Values have to be changed, yes, but this will not be enough. Since human nature has been altered and weakened in all those years of being subjected to Christian morality, we must work on strengthening this nature until it is ready to receive the new values. Any attempt at immediate solutions, like the French Revolution, are bound to fail. We have to work within the liberal system and gradually change the customs and the values. At some point, this will produce a healthier humanity, which will be able to devise a better system and a better society. This emerging line of thought became more prominent in his next book, The Gay Science, published in 1882. The opening aphorism states that,
"Whether I look with a good or an evil eye upon men, I find them always at one problem, each and all of them, to do that which conduces to the conservation of the human species, and certainly not out of any sentiment of love for this species, but simply because nothing in them is older, stronger, more inexorable, and more unconquerable than that instinct, because it is precisely the essence of our race and herd. Although we are accustomed readily enough, with our usual short-sightedness, to separate our neighbours precisely into useful and hurtful, into good and evil men, yet when we make a general calculation, and on longer reflection on the whole question, we become distrustful of this defining and separating, and finally leave it alone. Even the most hurtful man is still perhaps, in respect to the conservation of the race, the most useful of all, for he conserves in himself, or by his effect on others, impulses without which mankind might long ago have languished or decayed. Hatred, delight in mischief, rapacity and ambition, and whatever else is called evil, belong to the marvellous economy of the conservation of the race. To be sure, a costly, lavish, and on the whole very foolish economy, which has, however, hitherto preserved our race, as is demonstrated to us.
Again, Nietzsche relies on evolutionary ideas. The idea here is that all of our current instincts are those that survive the process of evolution, meaning that they are all instincts that we need in order to continue to exist. Which means that all those systems of morality that try to suppress certain human instincts are actually detrimental, in the long run, to the cause of human well-being and happiness. We need all of these instincts, and we need to allow all of them to be expressed. This video is titled My Nietzschean Liberalism, and this is a core tenet in my liberal beliefs. I am a freedom of expression maximalist. Everything within us that wants to express itself has some value. Of course, certain types of expression in certain situations might be harmful, and we should limit them in those specific situations. But a lot of people want to ban some types of expression altogether, types that, they believe, lead to degeneracy, extremism, or chaos. I believe that our human nature is basically healthy, so in the long run, if you allow everything to be expressed, the net result will be better than if we apply censorship. That's in regards to society. What about the individual? Is Nietzsche saying that the individual should just follow their instincts and satisfy any craving when it arises within them? No, not exactly. Let's keep on reading the opening aphorism. It is a very long aphorism, so we are reading only parts of it. Let's jump a few lines ahead.
But thou wilt never find him who would be quite qualified to mock at thee, the individual, at thy best, who could bring home to thy conscience its limitless, buzzing and croaking wretchedness, so as to be in accord with truth. To laugh at oneself, as one would have to laugh in order to laugh out of the veriest truth. To do this, the best have not hitherto had enough of the sense of truth, and the most endowed have had far too little genius. There is perhaps still a future even for laughter, when the maxim, quote, "the race is all, the individual is nothing," unquote, has incorporated itself in humanity, and when access stands open to everyone, at all times, to this ultimate emancipation and irresponsibility, perhaps then laughter will have united with wisdom. Perhaps then there will be only, quote, "joyful wisdom," unquote.
Here is one of those Nietzschean passages that are very easy to get wrong. When he says that the ultimate truth is that the race is all, the individual is nothing, it sounds like he is promoting a collectivist ideology. But he is not posing it as an ideal. He is posing it as a truth of our nature. What he is saying is that we should realize that our instincts did not evolve to serve the individuals, but to serve the human race. This, he says, is a truth that none of us wants to face, because of our sense of self-importance. But if we do internalize this truth, and learn to laugh at ourselves and our narcissism, we will be liberated and learn to accept all of our instincts, even those that seem shameful. Then, says Nietzsche, there will be only joyful wisdom. The term joyful wisdom is how the translator of this edition chose to translate the name of the book. Others translate it as gay science, which I think is more suitable. Here we have the origin of the title, and get the gist of what it means. It is a unification of laughter and wisdom that will be achieved when we learn to look at our existence differently. We will understand it more as we go along. For now, let's continue to read from this aphorism.
Meanwhile, however, it is quite otherwise. Meanwhile, the comedy of existence has not yet, quote, become conscious, unquote, of itself. Meanwhile, it is still the period of tragedy, the period of morals and religions.
We are not at that stage yet. We are still in the period where humans create moral systems that define part of human nature as bad and try to restrict it. They want to create a better humanity, but they keep failing, and so they perceive human existence as tragic. They don't realize that they are actually just playing a part in the comedy of existence, in which all these systems are just folly, to be washed away by waves of laughter as they are revealed in their baselessness. This is what the rest of the aphorism is describing, and it concludes by saying,
But with all this corrective laughter, human nature has on the whole been changed by the ever-new appearance of those teachers of the design of existence. Human nature has now an additional requirement, the very requirement of the ever-new appearance of such teachers and doctrines of, quote, design, unquote. Man has gradually become a visionary animal, who has to fulfill one more condition of existence than the other animals. Man must, from time to time, believe that he knows why he exists. His species cannot flourish without periodically confiding in life, without the belief in reason in life. And always, from time to time, will the human race decree anew that, quote, there is something which really must not be laughed at, unquote. And the most clairvoyant philanthropist will add that, quote, not only laughing and joyful wisdom, but also the tragic, with all its sublime irrationality, counts among the means and necessities for the conservation of the race, unquote. and consequently, do you understand me, O my brothers? Do you understand this new law of ebb and flow? We also shall have our time.
Before, Nietzsche affirmed all of our instincts and our so-called bad traits, saying that they are all actually a positive thing. But it sounded like he does hold some things as negative, namely, those moral systems that try to repress the so-called bad instincts. Wrong, says Nietzsche. I regard even those systems as a positive thing. They also represent the human drive, and they are also necessary for our survival. From that, he deduces that history has a periodical nature, in which tragic ages are followed by comic ages. The 19th century was very tragic in nature, believing it can fix the world and failing. This means that the very comic age, the thing that he is hoping for, is about to come. This positivity is the essence of the book. It is partly influenced by Nietzsche recovering from the recent bout of the disease, and the feeling of convalescence permeates every page. Here is an aphorism he apparently wrote on New Year's Day of 1882.
For the new year. I still live, I still think. I must still live, for I must still think. Sum ergo cogito, cogito ergo sum. Today, everyone takes the liberty of expressing his wish and his favorite thought. Well, I also mean to tell what I have wished for myself today, and what thought first crossed my mind this year. A thought which ought to be the basis, the pledge, and the sweetening of all my future life. I want more and more to perceive the necessary characters in things as beautiful. I shall thus be one of those who beautify things. Amor fati, let that henceforth be my love. I do not want to wage war with the ugly. I do not want to accuse. I do not even want to accuse the accusers. Looking aside, let that be my sole negation. And, all in all, to sum up, I wish to be at any time thereafter only a yea-sayer.
Nietzsche, then, sets a new ideal for himself. He wants to learn to say yes about everything, embrace everything in his existence as a positive thing. This includes everything in his nature, all his drives and instincts, but also everything that happens to him, everything that fate throws his way. How does one do that? Is it simply something psychological, training yourself to enjoy what previously brought you suffering? No, it is a matter of changing your worldview, and adopting a worldview that sees things in a positive way. We feel things as bad because they are harmful to our current way of life. If we change our worldview, if, as he put it before, new maxims will be incorporated by humanity, we will create a happy humanity. This is what the gay science is about. It is a science on how to become happy. It is no simple matter. One cannot just convince themselves that death, illness, violence, pain, cruelty, and all the other things that we currently consider bad are actually good. It is a long process of experimentation in states of consciousness, which will eventually lead to the formation of a worldview that turns bad into good. We've already seen one example of that, with how Nietzsche went through his illness and came out of it with the realization that illness is actually a good thing, that helps him find greater powers within himself, and consequently greater joys. Regular science tries to find ways to cure illness. Gay science welcomes illness as something that has to be experienced and overcome through the power of the spirit. So, while regular science does experiments on nature, in order to learn how to control it and thus reduce suffering to make life more comfortable for humans, gay science does experiments on the human spirit, to find out how to change its view of existence, and make it more joyful. Comfort, says Nietzsche, is not what we should be aspiring to.
The goal of science. What? The ultimate goal of science is to create the most pleasure possible to man, and the least possible pain? But what if pleasure and pain should be so closely connected that he who wants the greatest amount of one must also have the greatest possible amount of the other? that he who wants to experience the, quote, heavenly high jubilation, unquote, must also be ready to be, quote, sorrowful unto death, end quote.
Science aspires to remove the causes of human suffering. But what if, asks Nietzsche, by doing that we are depriving man of what gives him spiritual powers, and thus remove man's ability to have the highest forms of joy?
At present also ye have still the choice, either the least possible pain, in short, painlessness, and after all, socialists and politicians of all parties could not honourably promise more to their people, or the greatest possible amount of pain, as the price of the growth of a fullness of refined delights and enjoyments rarely tasted hitherto. If ye decide for the former, if ye therefore want to depress and minimize man's capacity for pain, well, ye must also depress and minimize his capacity for enjoyment.
Nietzsche takes it to the political realm as well, pointing out that both liberal politicians and socialist reformers can offer us no higher goal than the reducing of suffering. He believes that humanity should aspire to something greater. Human suffering is deep and powerful, more powerful than human daily pleasures. Eliminating it would make humans less deep and less powerful, and thus less capable of feeling powerful joys. Instead of trying to eliminate it, why don't we, by applying gay science, learn how to view its causes in a positive way? Then we will create new types of joy, more powerful than the ones we know. This, then, is the theory. But how will it be manifested in practice? Who will be the scientists who will carry out these spiritual experimentations? In this book, Nietzsche begins to talk about people who have what he calls a noble character.
Noble and ignoble. To ignoble natures all noble, magnanimous sentiments appear inexpedient, and on that account first and foremost as incredible. They blink with their eyes when they hear of such matters, and seem inclined to say, quote, there will, no doubt, be some advantage therefrom. One cannot see through all walls, unquote. They are jealous of the noble person, as if he sought advantage by backstair methods, when they are all too plainly convinced of the absence of selfish intentions and emoluments. The noble person is regarded by them as a kind of fool. They despise him in his gladness, and laugh at the lustre of his eye.
The masses, says Nietzsche, believe that every act is done for some personal gain. Because of that, they are also susceptible to moral systems that promote the good of the herd. They realize that if everyone was allowed to follow selfish needs, society would crumble, and then everyone would lose. So, they agree that their selfish nature must be restrained, and denigrate individualism. And since they judge acts by their utility, they perceive an act as moral if it is done for the good of the herd, and against the selfish nature. They cannot fathom that there are people who would perform individualistic acts not in order to gain something, but because the act itself brings them joy. The latter people are what he calls the noble people.
For the noble, magnanimous, and self-sacrificing person succumbs in fact to his impulses, and in his best moments his reason lapses altogether. He possesses feelings of pleasure and pain of such intensity that the intellect must either be silent before them or yield itself to their service. His heart then goes into his head, and one henceforth speaks of, quote, passions, unquote.
Human society, as stated, represses our natural impulses. Most people can handle this repression, but there are those in which one or more of these impulses are so powerful and cause such great joy that their reason cannot stand before them. This can lead to animalistic behavior, but not necessarily. If they direct their intellect to work in the service of that impulse, find a way to sublimate it just enough for it to still be joyful but not destructive, it becomes what Nietzsche calls a passion. With this passion, they can create great things, which will liberate what was repressed and turn it into a positive value. Thus, humanity will be taken to higher grounds. The mark of noble people is that they are driven by such passions.
Against the disparages of nature. They are disagreeable to me, those men in whom every natural inclination forthwith becomes a disease, something disfiguring or even disgraceful. They have seduced us to the opinion that the inclinations and impulses of men are evil. They are the cause of our great injustice to our own nature and to all nature. There are enough of men who may yield to their impulses gracefully and carelessly, but they do not do so for fear of that imaginary, quote, evil thing, unquote, in nature. That is the cause why there is so little nobility to be found among men, the inclination of which will always be to have no fear of oneself, to expect nothing disgraceful from oneself, to fly without hesitation whithersoever we are impelled, we free-born birds. Wherever we come, there will always be freedom and sunshine around us.
The repression of the body has made us alienated to ourselves, and also alienated to the nature around us, which our body is part of. The result is that we feel trapped in an alien world, and miserable. Those of noble character are those who rebelled against this state and let their natural impulses loose, but did not yield to them. They used their reason to channel them to constructive paths, and thus developed a noble character. They should now continue to do so, continue to follow their nature and create new worldviews that channel it in positive directions. The result will be the liberation of man.
What is living? Living. That is to continually eliminate from ourselves what is about to die. Living. That is to be cruel and inexorable towards all that becomes weak and old in ourselves, and not only in ourselves. Living. That means, therefore, to be without piety toward the dying, the wretched, and the old? To be continually a murderer? And yet old Moses said, quote, "Thou shalt not kill," unquote.
And here is where the moral dilemma arises. We reject external moral laws and follow our own rules. We want to grow in power and happiness, and for that we must kill anything that is holding back the life forces raging within us. On the personal level, this poses no dilemma. We get rid of the parts within ourselves, like fears, bad indulgences, or restrictive ideas, that are keeping us from growing. But what happens on the social level? There are also many people that are holding us back. Are we allowed to kill these people? What in our ethics forbids us from doing so? This is a question that Nietzsche will have to answer in his future books. And with that in mind, we move to his next book, which is Thus Spake Zarathustra. Here, everything comes to fruition, and all the ideas coalesce into one coherent philosophy. From the insight that the feeling of power is the greatest joy, he develops the idea of will to power, as the driving force of all living beings. The will to power wants to overcome, conquer, and grow. It is in all of us, and it gives you a feeling of joy whenever you manage to overcome something. This leads to the idea of self-surpassing, which happens when you create yourself anew in a more powerful form. In other words, when you create a new worldview which transforms things you previously regarded as bad into good things, that bring you happiness. The moment of self-surpassing is the greatest joy of all, and even after this joy subsides, you are still stronger than you were before, and thus happier. Eventually, the goal is to achieve a utopian state that is beyond good and evil. That is, a state in which everything in your existence brings you joy, so you no longer divide things into good and bad, but simply live your life and enjoy it. Zarathustra calls this state the Superman. The Superman is man self-surpassing, when he transforms into a greater being, a being that is beyond good and evil. The book is written in the form of a story about a sage called Zarathustra. If you watch the fourth video in the series, you know that it is a story of self-surpassing, in which Zarathustra surpasses himself and replaces the worldview of the Superman with the worldview of the eternal recurrence. The gist of the transformation is that he no longer regards the Superman as the ideal, but rather those heavenly moments of self-surpassing. However, To achieve self-surpassing, one must still pose a target that is greater than themselves, something to aspire to. Thus, the idea of the Superman is still contained in the new worldview, and it becomes relevant to Nietzsche's politics. A lot of readers make the mistake of thinking that the Superman is a state that is attainable for us. Actually, Nietzsche does not believe any human of his time can achieve it. There are many transformations and self-surpassings we must go through before we surpass what humans are today, and it is beyond the reach of any contemporary individual. It is a project for humanity, a project that will last centuries. Zarathustra first tries to preach this project to the masses, but they make fun of him. He then goes into the wilderness and collects a small group of disciples, to whom he imparts his ideas. He teaches them that they should get away from society and blaze their own individual path, but also that they should not go it alone. They need friends who are individualists like them, and thus will also be rivals, who will challenge their ideas and force them to surpass them and create something more powerful. Through this battle of ideas, humanity will get closer to the Superman. But in order to have friends, one must have a moral code. Art thou a slave? Then thou canst not be a friend. Art thou a tyrant? Then thou canst not have friends, says Zarathustra. The will to power wants to conquer, and its vulgar expressions are domination over other people, or foregoing your individuality and becoming part of something more powerful than yourself. But you must not succumb to the cravings of becoming a tyrant or a slave. You must be a free man in a community of free men. You must direct your will to power towards self-surpassing, towards shaping and reshaping your own spirit, not against other people. Nietzsche's morality, then, dictates that you should protect the well-being and freedom of other people. This, it seems, solves the dilemma we posed earlier about the boundaries of individualist action. But not entirely, because Nietzsche here speaks only of part of humanity. He speaks only of those who are of noble character and free spirit, and take part in the project of grey science, which will lead to the Superman. What about the others, the majority of humanity, who prefer to remain part of the herd? What are the boundaries of our actions towards them? Zarathustra doesn't deal with this question. He just ignores these people, and stays away from them. We shall have to see if we can find an answer later. Politically, Zarathustra pours derision on liberal democracy, even though it is designed to protect the freedom of the individual, which is essential to his ethics. His argument against democracy is that it allows the herd, the majority, to use this freedom to culturally spread their collectivist ideas, and to ostracize those who are noble. The herd is trying to reduce everyone to its level, and liberal democracy is characterized by mediocrity. What is the alternative, then? Again, we shall have to keep on reading. Nietzsche's next book is Beyond Good and Evil, from 1886. It returns to the aphoristic style, but now with the self-assuredness of a philosopher who is presenting a new philosophy. Let's see what he has to say about modern society.
Whether we call it civilization, or humanizing, or progress, which now distinguishes the European, whether we call it simply, without praise or blame, by the political formula, the democratic movement in Europe, behind all the moral and political foregrounds pointed to by such formulas, an immense physiological process goes on, which is ever extending the process of the assimilation of Europeans, their increasing detachment from the conditions under which, climatically and hereditarily, united races originate, their increasing independence of every definite milieu, that for centuries would fain inscribe itself with equal demands on soul and body, that is to say, the slow emergence of an essentially supranational and nomadic species of man, who possesses, physiologically speaking, a maximum of the art and power of adaptation as his typical distinction.
This aphorism talks about the process of what Nietzsche calls the democratization of Europe, which he sees as a process of making all Europeans the same. This sameness has a couple of dimensions. First, it erases the distinctions of nationality, race and class, and just makes all Europeans have the same identity. Secondly, it affects them on a physiological level as well. Races that had different biological traits are losing their distinctions and becoming the same. The overall effect reduces all people to the same level, as part of the herd. The modern Europeans believe that this is a good thing, the ideal society, but Nietzsche sees it as leading towards something else.
This process will probably arrive at results on which its naive propagators and panegyrists, the apostles of modern ideas, would least care to reckon. The same new conditions under which on an average a levelling and mediocrising of man will take place. A useful, industrious, variously serviceable and clever, gregarious man are in the highest degree suitable to give rise to exceptional men of the most dangerous and attractive qualities. While the collective impression of such future Europeans will probably be that of numerous, talkative, weak-willed, and very handy workmen who require a master, a commander, as they require their daily bread. While, therefore, the democratizing of Europe will tend to the production of a type prepared for slavery in the most subtle sense of the term, this strong man will necessarily, in individual and exceptional cases, become stronger and richer than he has perhaps ever been before, owing to the unprejudicedness of his schooling, owing to the immense variety of practice, art, and disguise. I meant to say that the democratizing of Europe is at the same time an involuntary arrangement for the rearing of tyrants, taking the word in all its meanings, even in its most spiritual sense.
The process is turning everyone into part of the herd, and people with herd mentality yearn for a shepherd. This lays the ground for the rise of tyrants, who will impose their will on the masses and create dictatorships. So this process will not yield the results its propagators wish for. But the use of the word tyrant here is meant to have many meanings. For those who have a strong character, this democratizing effect is also a blessing, forcing them to deal with many different situations and becoming stronger as a result. They can become tyrants, but not necessarily. They can also choose another path, as we shall soon discuss. But first, who is to blame for Europe becoming like this? Again, Nietzsche blames mainly religion.
The hitherto paramount religions, to give a general appreciation of them, are among the principal causes which have kept the type of man upon a lower level. They have preserved too much that which should have perished. One has to thank them for invaluable services, and who is sufficiently rich in gratitude not to feel poor at the contemplation of all that the spiritual men of Christianity have done for Europe hitherto. But when they had given comfort to the sufferers, courage to the oppressed and despairing, a staff and support to the helpless, and when they had allured from society into covenants and spiritual penitentiaries the broken-hearted and distracted, what else had they to do in order to work systematically in that fashion, and with a good conscience for the preservation of all the sick and suffering, which means, indeed and truth, to work for the deterioration of the European race, to reverse all estimates of value. That is what they had to do. And to shatter the strong, to spoil great hopes, to cast suspicion on the delight in beauty, to break down everything autonomous, manly, conquering, and imperious, all instincts which are natural to the highest and most successful type of man, into uncertainty, distress of conscience, and self-destruction.
Once again, he names Christianity as the culprit for making compassion the basis of morality. But here he adds two new reasons why this is bad. First, it preserved all the weak and sickly humans, and thus contributed, over time, to the weakening of the human race. Secondly, it necessitated the twisting of morality, the reversal of all previous values. Previously, says Nietzsche, the moral values were meant to make humans stronger. Now, they are designed to protect the weak by restricting the strong. He wants to reverse course yet again and direct the process of evolution towards creating a stronger humanity. Alright, but how do we do that? Well,
we, who hold a different belief, we, who regards a democratic movement not only as a degenerating form of political organization, but as equivalent to a generating, a waning type of man, as involving his mediocrizing and depreciation. Where have we to fix our hopes? In new philosophers. There is no other alternative. In minds strong and original enough to initiate opposite estimates of values, to transvalue and invert eternal valuations. In forerunners, in men of the futures, who in the present shall fix the constraints and fasten the knots which will compel millenniums to take new path.
This is Nietzsche's answer. Those are the type of people that he was talking about. The people who are free in spirit and noble in character. The people who resist the herd and form a community of their own. The people who do gay science and experiment on their spirit will have to be the ones to forge new values. Eventually, he hopes, these experiments and values will produce a new breed of leaders.
The image of such leaders hovers before our eyes. Is it lawful for me to say it aloud? We free spirits. The conditions which one would partly have to create and partly utilize for their genesis. The presumptive methods and tests by virtue of which a soul should grow up to such an evolution and power as to feel a constraint to these tasks, a transvaluation of values under the new pressure and hammer of which a conscience should be steeled and a heart transformed into brass, so as to bear the weight of such responsibility.
However, there is no certainty that such leaders will emerge, that this transvaluation of values will occur. The rest of aphorism 203 is quite dark, and we feel like Nietzsche is going crazy by the contrast between his vision of how great humanity can be, compared with how wretched he feels it might become.
He who divines the fate that is hidden under the idiotic unwariness and blind confidence of modern ideas, and still more under the whole of Christo-European morality suffers from an anguish with which no other is to be compared. He sees at a glance all that could still be made out of man through a favorable accumulation and augmentation of human powers and arrangements. He knows, with all the knowledge of his conviction, how unexhausted man still is for the greatest possibilities, and how often in the past the type man has stood in presence of mysterious decisions and new paths. He knows still better from his painfulest recollections on what wretched obstacles promising developments of the highest rank have hitherto usually gone to pieces, broken down, sunk, and become contemptible. The universal degeneracy of mankind to the level of the man of the future, as idealized by the socialist fools and shallow-pates, this degeneracy and dwarfing of man to an absolutely gregarious animal, or as they call it, to a man of free society, this brutalizing of man into a pygmy with equal rights and claims, is undoubtedly possible. He who has thought out this possibility to its ultimate conclusion knows another loathing unknown to the rest of mankind, and perhaps also a new mission.
These are the stakes, then. Either we perform a transvaluation of our values and turn the course of history towards creating stronger humans, or we devolve into wretched beings who are incapable of true happiness. With such high stakes, the free spirits must not be bound by any qualms that come from today's notions of good and evil.
The essential thing, however, in a good and healthy aristocracy is that it should not regard itself as a function either of the kingship or the commonwealth, but as the significance and highest justification thereof, that it should therefore accept with a good conscience the sacrifice of a legion of individuals who for its sake must be suppressed and reduced to imperfect men, to slaves and instruments. Its fundamental belief must be precisely that society is not allowed to exist for its own sake, but only as a foundation and scaffolding, by means of which a select class of beings may be able to elevate themselves to their higher duties, and in general to a higher existence.
Instead of democracy, then, Nietzsche favors an aristocracy, and quite a dictatorial one, it seems. This is one of those aphorisms which today, knowing what happened in the 20th century, we read with a shudder. However, we must remember that what he is talking about is not a traditional aristocracy, in which society is divided into classes, and in which being part of the ruling class is a birthright. Nobility for him isn't a matter of blood, but a matter of character. Those who are noble in character can come from all walks of society, so a despotic aristocracy will actually prevent them from rising. What he is actually propagating, then, is still a liberal democracy, but one in which those of noble character do not conform to the values of the herd. The lines in which he talks about the noblemen treating others as slaves and instruments are not a recipe for how they should behave, but a reminder of what the nature of aristocrats traditionally was. In a liberal democracy, where human rights are protected, they will not be able to treat others in this way, but they should have the same attitude of contempt and disregard towards them. They must focus on their mission of creating new values. What characterizes one who is noble in character? The aphorism we just read belongs to a chapter titled What is Noble, which attempts to answer this question. 2 aphorisms later, Nietzsche introduces a couple of new concepts into his philosophy.
In a tour through the many finer and coarser moralities that have hitherto prevailed or still prevail on the earth, I found certain traits recurring regularly together and connected with one another until finally 2 primary types revealed themselves to me, and a radical distinction was brought to light. There is master morality and slave morality.
So, there are 2 types of morality. First, he portrays master morality.
In the first case, when it is the rulers who determine the conception good, it is the exalted, proud disposition that is regarded as the distinguishing feature, and that determines the order of rank. The noble type of man separates from himself the beings in whom the opposite of this exalted, proud disposition displays itself. He despises them. Let it at once be noted that in this first kind of morality the antithesis good and bad means practically the same as noble and despicable. The antithesis good and evil is of a different origin.
Master morality is determined by what feels good. Remember, Nietzsche believes that our nature, as a product of millions of years of evolution, knows what's good for us. So he prefers this type of morality that follows our nature, a morality in which what causes a feeling of exaltation within us is defined as good. In this morality, the things that give us a bad feeling are defined not as evil, but as bad. In ancient times, when rulers had absolute power, it was only the rulers who could follow their nature and do whatever they wanted. So they were the ones who held this morality. Hence, it is a master morality.
It is obvious that everywhere the designations of moral value were at first applied to men, and were only derivatively and at a later period applied to actions. It is a gross mistake, therefore, when historians of morals start with questions like, why have sympathetic actions been praised? The noble type of man regards himself as a determiner of values. He does not require to be approved of. He passes the judgment. What is injurious to me is injurious in itself. He knows that it is he himself only who confers honor on things. He is a creator of values. He honors whatever he recognizes in himself. Such morality equals self-glorification.
Historians of today, says Nietzsche, are making a mistake when they ask why certain deeds were regarded as good and others as bad. They look at it through the perspective of today's morality, and don't realize that it used to be determined differently. It wasn't the deeds, but the people who were defined as good or bad. Good deeds were defined as the kind of deeds that the good people do. And it was the masters, the noblemen, who were seen as the good people. They were the ones who created the values, and they had the power to enforce them on others. Today, those of noble character no longer have that power, but the implication is that they should still create values for themselves. Furthermore, they should liberate their mind of the prevailing morality and regard themselves as good people, because, as he already said in previous books, those who perceive themselves as good are driven to live up to this definition by doing good.
In the foreground there is the feeling of plenitude, of power, which seeks to overflow, the happiness of high tension, the consciousness of a wealth that would fain give and bestow. The noble man also helps the unfortunate, but not, or scarcely, out of pity, but rather from an impulse generated by the superabundance of power. The noble man honors in himself the powerful one, him also who has power over himself, who knows how to speak and how to keep silence, who takes pleasure in subjecting himself to severity and hardness, and has reverence for all that is severe and hard.
The noble man, who creates values and goes through the process of self-surpassing, continues to grow and become more and more powerful. As a result, his soul becomes rich, and this makes him a generous person. A good example for what Nietzsche means can be found in Thus Spake Zarathustra, in which Zarathustra's wisdom and happiness are so great that they overflow his soul, and he has the need to share them with others. This is why he descends from his mountain and seeks the company of humans. He wants to endow them with his gifts. So instead of making charity a duty that people must fulfill, which is what the moral systems based on compassion do, we should teach them a morality which makes them develop their natural gifts, and then it will simply be second nature for them to be charitable. In short, in a master morality, one does not need a table of rules of thou shalt and shan't do. They are good by character, and therefore do good deeds without having to obey any external rules. The aphorism carries on and describes the virtues of master morality, but then switches to talk about that other type of morality.
All these are typical characteristics of the noble morality, which, as has been pointed out, is not the morality of modern ideas, and is therefore at present difficult to realize and also to unearth and disclose. It is otherwise with the second type of morality, slave morality. Supposing that the abused, the oppressed, the suffering, the unemancipated, the weary, and those uncertain of themselves should moralize, what will be the common element in their moral estimates? Probably a pessimistic suspicion with regard to the entire situation of man will find expression, perhaps a condemnation of man, together with his situation. The slave has an unfavorable eye for the virtues of the powerful. He has a skepticism and distrust, a refinement of distrust of everything good that is there honored. He would fain persuade himself that the very happiness there is not genuine.
Slave morality is held by those who are not happy. Because of that, they don't even know what true happiness is, and persuade themselves that those who have a master morality are not happy either. Alas, for some reason, it is slave morality that rules our culture today, and this is why it is hard for us to even understand what master morality is, and we recoil when we hear the idea that morality can be based on selfish feelings. Instead, we are trapped in the values that are created by slave morality.
On the other hand, those qualities that serve to alleviate the existence of sufferers are brought into prominence and flooded with light. It is here that sympathy, the kind helping hand, the warm heart, patience, diligence, humility, and friendliness attain to honor. For here these are the most useful qualities, and almost the only means of supporting the burden of existence. Slave morality is essentially the morality of utility. Here is the seat of the origin of the famous antithesis good and evil. Power and dangerousness are assumed to reside in the evil, a certain dreadfulness, subtlety, and strength which do not admit of being despised.
Slave morality is based not on enhancing happiness, but on reducing suffering. Thus, it promotes compassion, charity, self-negation, utility for the collective, and so forth. Because of that, it also seeks to muzzle those who are selfish and powerful, and defines them as evil. So while master morality defines things as good and bad according to how they make you feel, slave morality defines things as good and evil according to how useful they are for the collective. In summation, we are all trapped today in a slave morality, which prevents us from achieving true happiness. But this is not how it always was. There were times when master morality ruled, and was held by the ruling class. What happened? How did everything become so twisted? This is one of the questions that are left lingering from the discussion of morality in this book. And so, once he was done writing it, Nietzsche sat down to write an addendum, which became another book, The Genealogy of Morals. The Genealogy of Morals is a polemic. The aphoristic style is ditched, and instead we get 3 long essays. This makes it arguably the easiest to understand of all of Nietzsche's books, and I think that today it is his most read and influential work. In fact, I will venture to proclaim that most people who today talk about Nietzsche and pretend to be authorities on his work read only the first essay of the Genealogy of Morals and the prologue of Thus Spake Zarathustra. And that's not enough to get a full understanding of Nietzsche's philosophy, not even of his morality. Since this video is dedicated to Nietzsche's views on morality, we shall now perform an in-depth, albeit succinct, analysis of this book. Let's begin with the preface, in which Nietzsche tells us that at age 13 he already felt that there was something wrong with contemporary morality. He felt that there was life surging within him, life that is joyous, rich and exhilarating, life that wants to grow, explore and conquer. Yet morality was telling him that earthly life is bad, and he should repress these life forces. It made him suspicious of morality, and as he grew, he started to question it. What he finds weird is that seemingly no one else feels this way, and they all just accept that contemporary morality is the one and only morality. This book, he hopes, will finally start a conversation in which we develop a more critical approach. The first essay is titled Good and Evil, Good and Bad. It starts by criticizing what he calls the English psychologists, a group of 19th century English thinkers who belong to the utilitarian movement, and their perception of morality. They claim that deeds that proved to be useful for society started to be called good, and later on, people started to believe that they originate from goodness, and forgot their utilitarian origin. Nietzsche commends these thinkers for trying to look for the origins of morality in a place other than goodness, but says they got it all wrong. Their mistake is that they assume that today's morality is what morality always was. In contrast, he repeats his claim that morality used to be very different, and became twisted over time. What we should do, then, is unearth what morality used to be, and then follow how and why it changed through history. This is what is called genealogy. Nietzsche, who majored in philology, then performs an inquiry into the roots of words in different languages, and points out that the words for good are etymologically close to words like strong, noble and ruling, whereas the words for bad are close to words that denote poor, weak and wretched. He concludes from that in the dawn of humanity, the ruling classes were the ones who determined what morality is, and that they created the notions of good out of what made them feel good, and bad out of what made them feel bad. But there are several types of ruling classes. In some places, the warriors are the rulers, and they create values based on their natural impulses. In other places, the priests are the rulers, and they create values based on concepts like purity and holiness, which require repression of impulses. At one point in history, namely the moment when Rome faced Judea, these two types stood against each other. Rome, ruled by warriors, defeated and enslaved Judea, but the priests of Judea took revenge by creating values that undermined Roman morality. Those are the values of slave morality. Out of Judaism came Christianity, which refined the Jewish morality, concealed the fact that it is rooted in revenge, and made it seem to be about love. Eventually, Christianity took over Rome, and slave morality prevailed. By now, it has triumphed to such a degree that we don't even realize that morality used to be something very different. Alright, he then says in the name of a 19th century liberal. So what if those values won? Shouldn't we be thankful for that? This gave us the liberal values, the values of equality and freedom for all. Isn't that better than the values of Rome? And he replies,
The revolt of the slaves in morals begins in the very principle of resentment, becoming creative and giving birth to values. A resentment experienced by creatures who, deprived as they are of the proper outlet of action, are forced to find their compensation in an imaginary revenge. While every aristocratic morality springs from a triumphant affirmation of its own demands, the slave morality says no from the very outset to what is outside itself, different from itself, and not itself. And this no is its creative deed.
Slave morality is not based on what feels good. It is based on resentment towards the masters that enslaved you. Therefore, everything that the masters define as good is defined in slave morality as bad, and its opposite is defined as good. While master morality wants worthy rivals, those who will challenge you and compel you to become stronger, slave morality wants to destroy its rivals, which are all those who have a master morality. We may think that liberal values are meant to do good for everyone, but since slave morality is at their basis, what's really at work here is not the wish to bring freedom and equality to all, but resentment towards those who are greater than average, those who stand out from the herd. Thus, liberalism and democracy are not going to lead to humans employing their freedom to achieve greatness, but to a grinding process of degradation, in which the mediocre masses, driven by resentment, will reduce everyone to their level. And that is why we should reject contemporary morality. Another characteristic of slave morality is that it comes out of weakness. While the masters could act on their impulses, sometimes at the expense of the slaves could not. But they told themselves that it is not because they are weak, but because they are good, and choose not to. This gave them a sense of moral superiority, an imaginary victory that satisfied their will to power. In that, they also created the ideas of absolute good and evil. The masters choose to do bad because they are evil, while we, the slaves, choose not to because we are good. One of the most powerful segments in the book is the part that describes how wretched weakness is translated into moral values.
Will anyone look right into the mystery of how ideals are manufactured in this world? Who has the courage to do it? Come. Here we have a vista opened in these grimy workshops. Wait just a moment, dear Mr. Inquisitive and Foolhardy. Your eye must first grow accustomed to this false, changing light. Yes, enough. Now speak. What is happening below down yonder? Speak out. Tell what you see, man of the most dangerous curiosity, for now I am the listener. I see nothing. I hear the more. It is a cautious, spiteful, gentle whispering and muttering together in all the corners and crannies. It seems to me that they are lying. A sugary softness adheres to every sound. Weakness is turned to merit. There is no doubt about it. It is just as you say. Further. And the impotence which requites not is turned to goodness, craven baseness to meekness, submission to those whom one hates, to obedience, namely obedience to one of whom they say that he ordered this submission. They call him God. The inoffensive character of the weak, the very cowardice in which he is rich, his standing at the door, his forced necessity of waiting, gain here fine names such as patience, which is also called virtue. Not being able to avenge oneself is called not wishing to avenge oneself. Perhaps even forgiveness. For they know not what they do. We alone know what they do. They also talk of the love of their enemies and sweat thereby.
This dialogue carries on some more, and in the end, the teacher asks the student to look deeper into the art of these dark magicians, and find their best trick, the one with which they manage to enchant everyone to accept their deceitful values. The student complies, and goes deeper.
I understand. I prick my ears up again. I hold up my nose. Now do I hear for the first time that which they have said so often. We good, we are the righteous. What they demand they call not revenge, but the triumph of righteousness. What they hate is not their enemy. No, they hate unrighteousness, godlessness. What they believe in and hope is not the hope of revenge, the intoxication of sweet revenge. Sweeter than honey, did Homer call it? But the victory of God, of the righteous God over the godless. What is left for them to love in this world is not their brothers in hate, but their brothers in love, as they say. All the good and righteous on the earth. And how do they name that which serves them as a solace against all the troubles of life, their phantasmagoria of their anticipated future blessedness? How? Do I hear right? They call it the last judgment, the advent of their kingdom, the kingdom of God. But in the meanwhile, they live in faith, in love, in hope. Enough, enough.
The trick that slave morality used to take over the world is the concept of Judgment Day. With that, Christianity conquered the masses, promising them that one day they shall inherit the earth. This morality pretends to be about love, even love for its enemies, but Nietzsche quotes famous Christian thinkers to argue that what actually drives them is resentment. They want revenge upon the masters, but are too weak to achieve it, so they promise themselves and their believers that at Judgment Day, they will witness all those that they hate burn in the fires of hell. And now, after the victory of this morality, we are all trapped in this culture, in which we tell ourselves that we are driven by love and goodness, but we are actually resentful. The second essay is titled Guilt, Bad Conscience and the Like, and it goes more into human psychology. It begins by asking how is it that a human animal learned how to remember things, when the brain is wired to forget? The answer is through cruelty. Men created cruel rituals designed to irrevocably mutilate their bodies so that they would constantly remember a certain commandment, and exacted cruel punishments so that criminals would live with constant pain, to remind them and everyone not to do it again. In time, this caused humans to develop a better memory. The punishments remained cruel, but for a different reason. Now it was to give the wronged party the pleasure of inflicting pain on the wrongdoer. Why is cruelty to others so pleasurable? Because it is an expression of will to power, the force that is driving all of us. Are we less cruel today? No, it's just that civilization has made us increasingly more delicate. Prehistoric people were able to withstand much greater pain than us. We are weaker, so the amount of pain we need to inflict in order to be cruel to each other is much lesser. But we are still driven by will to power, and its vulgar manifestation is cruelty. But the will to power works in other ways as well. One of them is man's need to interpret the world, in other words, to force his own picture on existence, and gain power over it. And because of that, humans constantly reinterpret their actions. This made them forget what the origins of punishment were, and they started to provide new interpretations. As they became an animal that can remember, they started to develop a sense of responsibility, and were now seen as responsible for their bad deeds. So now, the reasons given for punishment did not focus on the pleasure it gives the punisher, but on what it does to the punished. Nietzsche lists many of the reasons people use to justify punishing criminals, and agrees that they all have merit. But there is one reason that he rejects, and that is the idea that punishment is designed to generate a sense of guilt in the criminal, make them feel remorse. Guilt and remorse, he says, do not arise from being punished. We need to find their origins elsewhere. This leads to a key discussion in the understanding of Nietzsche's philosophy. Humans, he theorizes, used to be wild animals, driven by will to power that manifested in different cravings. Consciousness, at first, was merely a tool that helped them get what they need to satisfy these cravings. But then, the stronger humans imposed their will on the others, became the rulers, and decreed laws. Trapped within the human society and its laws, humans could no longer just satisfy their cravings whenever they wanted. Thus, the will to power was turned against itself, and part of it was used to repress the natural impulses. The consciousness became a battlefield between the natural impulses on one hand and the energy put into self-repression on the other. This made human consciousness deeper and richer, resulting in what we call a soul. Humans started to identify themselves with this soul, and believe that it is compatible with the values of the herd. But the natural impulses were still demanding satisfaction, and since they were deemed to be bad, humans started to blame themselves for having them, and developed guilt and remorse. In time, they created ideas such as the original sin, which made them feel like they are always guilty by merely being human. They started to perceive themselves as wretched beings. It should be emphasized that Nietzsche finds a lot of good in all of this. He believes we should be thankful for this process, because it made us capable of being individuals. This deepening of the soul, and its turning into a battlefield of powerful forces, turned man into a being with potential for greatness. But the baggage we acquired along the way, this belief in our own wretchedness, is now holding us back. This connects to a point already made in Dawn of Day, the idea that remorse is a feeling that we should get rid of, because it causes unnecessary suffering. With this essay, Nietzsche provides his theory for how it developed, showing that it is just part of slave morality, hoping that this will help us realize its redundancy and destructiveness. If we can turn things around in a way that our inner forces will stop repressing each other, but instead work in harmony, we can achieve great things. But he ends the essay, once again, by realizing that contemporary humans are not ready for this message. All we can do is hope for a future savior, a better type of human that will emerge and offer a better way. The third essay is titled, What is the Meaning of Ascetic Ideals? And it explores the genealogy of the idea that we should escape nature, escape our body, into a realm of pure spirituality. It's the longest essay, and I'll provide only a short summary here. Nietzsche says that the turning against nature was necessary for the development of civilization, and at first it was done by great people. Their will to power manifested in overcoming their natural impulses, developing the idea that they are above them. But once it became an ideal for all to follow, it caused the weakening and decay of humanity. Instead of controlling the impulses and directing them to constructive channels, man tries to repress them. But since they are part of us and cannot be fully repressed, they get twisted and manifest in destructive ways. This causes man to suffer, and religion presents itself as a cure for this suffering. But religion, especially Christianity, provides only narcotics to ease the pain, while simultaneously making man repress himself even more, leading to a vicious cycle which enhances the suffering. How do we get out of it? Modern man believes he presents an alternative with science, but modern science is still enslaved to the ascetic mindset, in making the scientist a neutral observer seeking the ultimate, metaphysical truth, instead of someone who explores his own nature along with the nature around him, and learning how to better integrate them. Modern art, as well, is still enslaved to this mindset. Modern man, in discarding religion, has only given up on the narcotics that ease the pain, but did not cure the root problem. This leads to loss of meaning in life. But since the will to power still wants to manifest itself, man wills the only thing that he has left, and that is the nothingness. The will to power now drives him to want to become nothing. The result is nihilism, the ultimate form of decadence. So, how can we overcome this? Well, there is actually a lot of potential in this state. By focusing on becoming pure spirit for so long, man has developed and enriched the spirit and gave it enormous power. If we can now reconnect the spirit to the natural impulses, great things can be achieved. But where will the savior come from? Well, Nietzsche reminds us that modern science came straight out of Christianity. Certain tenets of Christian morality, like the quest for truth, have eventually turned humans against Christianity, as they could no longer be reconciled with the Christian narrative. In other words, because of its morality, Christianity achieved self-surpassing in the field of epistemology, and created modern science. Now, a similar thing must happen in the field of morality, and Nietzsche expresses confidence that the will to power will ultimately lead the Europeans to achieve this self-surpassing. All of this talk about slave morality, and the need for a group of people to rebel against it, might remind you of another philosopher, who came about half a century after Nietzsche. The fictional novels of Ayn Rand describe a society basically ruled by slave morality, and the characters there are fun, albeit caricaturistic, portrayal of the type of decadent and pathetic people that Nietzsche talks about. And there are also characters who represent something resembling Nietzsche's master morality, who rebel against this society. In her final novel, Atlas Shrugged, she portrays this latter breed getting together and fighting back. The influence of Nietzsche is felt. But there are also many differences between Rand and Nietzsche. The fundamental difference is that he is a philosopher of becoming, while she is a philosopher of being. For Rand, you are who you are, and you can't change that. The choice you have is to act according to your nature, or bow to society's collectivist norms and act like others expect you to act. Thus, While Nietzsche encourages you to direct your powers to shape and reshape your spirit, for Rand, your spirit is not something that is shaped, but something that naturally is. Your powers, therefore, should be directed to shape the material world around you, and mold nature into objects that serve your needs. These objects can then be turned into commodities, which are traded through the capitalist system. Nietzsche didn't like capitalism. Being a man of spirit, he detested the vulgar materialism found in the capitalist system. Zarathustra calls it a system where you acquire wealth and become poor thereby. But if the choice is between capitalism and socialism, he would definitely choose capitalism, since socialism, in his eyes, is the highest manifestation of slave morality. Rand went further, and her aim was to create a spiritual basis for capitalism. She presents it not as a system fueled by greed, but by innovation and strive for greatness, something similar to Nietzsche's ideas of will to power and master morality. Atlas Shrugged, in particular, is a good example of Nietzsche's idea that a master morality leads to a generous character. The heroes, after they impose their vision on nature and create a product, feel the need to share it with the world, not just because they want to make money, but also because they enjoy seeing other people using it. The implication is that if everyone did that, if everyone lived according to their individual nature and will, we would all be richer and happier thereby. If we think Nietzsche's ideas through, we get to something rather similar, but in the realm of spirit. A life of self-surpassing makes your spirit overflowing with knowledge, ideas, and insights, and this overflow makes you want to share with others. If everyone did that, we would all be spiritually richer. But the will to power can also be directed to shape the world around you. Nietzsche would advise you to direct this activity towards art, but you can also make useful products that are an extension of your spirit, and then trade these products with others so we can all become materially richer. If you do that, you become a Nietzschean capitalist, and very close to Ayn Rand's ideal. If you are a Randian, I suggest studying Nietzsche's more spiritual approach as another dimension that you can add to your worldview. As we can see, Nietzsche's thought can easily be used as a basis for a liberal society, where free individuals empower each other. This would be close to my ideal picture of how society should be. Then again, it is true that slave morality thrives in the liberal order, which makes it rather nauseating for Nietzschean. Did Nietzsche come up with a new and better alternative? Let's carry on reading and find out. After the genealogy of morals, Nietzsche wrote a few more books in essay form, offering a more straightforward discussion of his ideas. But all the while, he kept writing aphorisms that were to be the basis of his magnum opus, a book that would attempt a transvaluation of all values, a book that was to kickstart a rebellion against contemporary morality and culture. Alas, his disease got the better of him before he completed it. His sister and his closest friend then compiled the aphorisms he left, put them in chapters according to his plan for the book, and published it as a book called The Will to Power. The end result is far from satisfactory. Many of the aphorisms are in an embryonic form. There are many repetitions, and the overall themes are not fully developed. Still, it is a treasure trove of ideas and insights, and gives a pretty good notion of where Nietzsche was headed. The book begins pretty much where the genealogy of morals ended, with a discussion of how slave morality led to the weakening of humanity, which led to human life losing its meaning and value, and thus causing the rise of nihilism. However, there are also positive aspects to this situation. We go back to the idea first presented in Dawn of Day, and see this nihilistic phase as a disease which humanity has to go through to emerge more powerful. There are two types of nihilism, says Nietzsche. One is the result of the weakening of humanity, and represents an exhaustion from life. The other represents life that wants to grow and become more powerful, and thus discards all existing values and becomes nihilistic, but only in order to discover new, empowering values.
First principle, everything that characterizes modern men savors of decay, but side by side with the prevailing sickness there are signs of a strength and powerfulness of soul which are still untried. The same causes which tend to promote the belittling of men, also force the stronger and rarer individuals upwards to greatness.
The same thing that caused the decadence is also what will bring us out of it. What is that thing? Of course, it is the will to power. Slave morality is also an expression of will to power. It is the will to power of the herd, of the weak and of the miserable, that has found a way to overcome the strong, happy individualists and subjugate them. But here we meet another idea we met before, the idea that this too was for the best. Several aphorisms discuss how it was necessary for the growth of humanity to go in that direction for a while. Before, the strong would impose their will on the weak and enslave them, and that meant that they were left with no one to challenge them, and couldn't go any further. Therefore, it is good that the mediocre now became powerful enough to hold their own against the strong.
The mightiest and most dangerous passions of man, by means of which he most easily goes to rack and ruin, have been so fundamentally banned that mighty men themselves have either become impossible or else must regard themselves as evil, harmful and prohibited. The losses are heavy, but up to the present they have been necessary. Now, however, that a whole host of counterforces has been reared, by means of the temporary suppression of these passions, the passion for dominion, the love of change and deception, their liberation has once more become possible. They will no longer possess their old savagery. We can now allow ourselves this tame sort of barbarism. Look at our artists and our statesmen.
It is something that had to happen, then. But now that the mediocre are strong enough to hold their own, we can once again free the wild horses, our most powerful impulses, and allow them to operate again. Nietzsche points out that we already see them operating, albeit in a trained form, in contemporary artists and statesmen. But that's not good enough. This trained barbarity is still within the confines of slave morality. What is needed is people who will turn the tide and adopt a master morality.
To oppose this dwarfing and adaptation of man to a specialized kind of utility, a reverse movement is needed, the procreation of the synthetic man who embodies everything and justifies it, that man for whom the turning of mankind into a machine is a first condition of existence, for whom the rest of mankind is but soil on which he can devise his higher mode of existence. He is in need of the opposition of the masses, of those who are leveled down. He requires that feeling of distance from them. He stands upon them, he lives on them. This higher form of aristocracy is the form of the future.
He reiterates the idea of a new aristocracy, which we met before. But here he emphasizes that it can only rise because the masses are more powerful now, due to the democratization of Europe. Standing on the shoulders of this democratic mass, the noblemen can rise to new heights. They can liberate their inner powers, without worrying that it will harm the weak. Thus, this counterforce of the masses will continue to oppose them, continue to present new challenges that will drive them to even higher peaks. Nietzsche, then, is not proposing that we try to teach master morality to the masses. He talks about the creation of two spheres, one for the mediocre masses, the other for those of noble character.
My philosophy aims at a new order of rank, not at an individualistic morality. The spirit of the herd should rule within the herd, but not beyond it. The leaders of the herd require a fundamentally different valuation for their actions, as do also the independent ones or the beasts of prey, etc.
So the herd should keep on holding its slave morality, but only if it allows the free spirits to create their own sphere, where they can have their master morality. This will prevent society from decaying. Basically, what Nietzsche is talking about is a liberal democracy, but one that is not completely ruled by slave morality. It's a democracy that does not try to restrain unique individualists, but allows them to express themselves in a free sphere where they can test new values. At the same time, it accepts that most people are mediocre, and does not try to transform society according to some ideal of greatness. Greatness is left for the special few. And this pretty much describes my political convictions. This is my Nietzschean liberalism. However, Nietzsche doesn't stop there. There are other ideas he presents in this book, ideas I do not agree with. Let's see where I disagree with Nietzsche, and why. It all goes back to morality. We see that he believes that the herd should hang on to its morality, and the moral code he is offering pertains only to those in the noble sphere. Earlier, we pointed out a problem with this moral code. He told us why we should cherish and protect others who are free spirits like ourselves, but not why we should do so for the mediocre masses. Can we find a principle for it now? Well, we've seen that he thinks that the herd is valuable for the nobleman, and we also know that being noble makes you a good and generous person, so that should prevent a nobleman from doing harm to a member of the herd. But a moral code should tell you more than that. It should also tell you how to act when you see someone in distress and you have the power to help them. What does his morality say about that? Well, if it is another noble person, you see value in that person, so you will help them. But what obliges you to help a mediocre person? The only discussion on that theme occurs in the fourth part of Thus Spake Zarathustra. This is a part that wasn't in the original book, a later addition. It is after Zarathustra found his way to happiness, and he sits on top of his mountain, happy and prospering. But then he hears a cry of distress coming from the valley below. Without thinking, he runs downhill and realizes that there are people who are climbing up the mountain. They finally realize that their values are rotten and lead them to decay and oblivion, so they go up to Zarathustra to learn how to be happy. Zarathustra invites them all to his cave, where he teaches them his values and transforms them into happy people. But on the next morning he wakes up and ponders on the events of the previous day, and is angry with himself for succumbing to his compassion for these people. They are not his business. He leaves them behind, and climbs even higher up the mountain. The message seems to be that you should not bother with those people. You should go your own way, and let them find their path themselves. The best you can do for them is present a model for them to follow. In aphorism 980 of The Will to Power, Nietzsche says that a philosopher should be an educator who, looking down from his lonely elevation, is powerful enough to draw long chains of generations up to him. This is very much in contrast with Plato's philosopher, who goes down the cave in order to liberate the people from the lie that they are living. I basically agree with Nietzsche's stance, but not in every case. There are people who are in such distress that they don't even have the opportunity to try to find their path to happiness. Like Nietzsche, I am against the idea that we have to work to bring everyone to the same level. But I do believe that we should work to give everyone a fighting chance, and this is not something that Nietzsche ever says. Nietzsche, I contend, is too harsh on feelings like compassion, pity and mercy. His philosophy does not justify such a complete rejection of these feelings. In many places he admits that they are also natural impulses, and that they also have merit, but he refuses to let them be part of his morality. I see no reason why that should be the case, and why they couldn't be part of the mix that creates a noble character, as long as they are not given too much power within that mix. It seems to me that his aversion to these feelings is not a logical conclusion he drew out of his philosophy, but a reaction to seeing what they did to people like Schopenhauer, how they made them turn against life. But this outcome is not inevitable, and these feelings should be part of any moral system. Nietzsche's rejection of them makes his morality deficient, in my eyes, and it also affects his political stance. Another problem is that he seems to leave his skepticism behind, and speak as if he has figured out the truth about human nature.
After thousands of years of error and confusion, it is my good fortune to have rediscovered the road which leads to a yea and to a nay. I teach people to say nay in the face of all that makes for weakness and exhaustion. I teach people to say yea in the face of all that makes for strength, that preserves strength, and justifies the feeling of strength.
I deeply connect to this sentiment. I believe in empowering people, and that the stronger you become in spirit, the happier you are. I am disgusted by today's victim culture, in which people wallow in their victimhood and cherish it as part of their identity, because I believe it only leads them to become resentful and miserable. But I do not presume that I hold the truth that would bring happiness to all people. Maybe empowerment is actually bad for you. Who knows? Nietzsche seems to have certainty that his position is the truth, and this, coupled with his lack of compassion, leads him down a rather tyrannical political path.
The advantages of standing detached from one's age. Detached from the two movements, that of individualism and that of collectivist morality, for even the first does not recognize the order of rank, and would give one individual the same freedom as another. My thoughts are not concerned with the degree of freedom which should be granted to the one or to the other or to all, but with the degree of power which the one or the other should exercise over his neighbor or over all, and more especially with the question to what extent a sacrifice of freedom, or even enslavement, may afford the basis for the cultivation of a superior type. In plain words, how could one sacrifice the development of mankind in order to assist a higher species than man to come into being?
Until now, we said that Nietzsche rejects collectivism and extols individualist morality. But Nietzsche clarifies here that this doesn't mean that he is a liberal who believes everyone should be equally free, because that, too, promotes equality and disregards the hierarchical differences between humans. His morality deals with how much power one is allowed to exert upon others, and he is willing to let one restrict the freedom of others, if the goal is to bring about the Superman. This is the only book, besides Thus Spake Zarathustra, that mentions the Superman. The Superman is a project that all humanity should take part in, and the aim is to one day surpass what man is now, to the point where there will be no more mediocre people.
A teaching is needed which is strong enough to work in a disciplinary manner. It should operate in such a way as to strengthen the strong and to paralyze and smash up the world weary. The annihilation of declining races. The decay of Europe. The annihilation of slave-tainted valuations. The dominion of the world as a means to the rearing of a higher type. The annihilation of the humbug which is called morality. Christianity as a hysterical kind of honesty in this regard, Augustine, Bunyan, the annihilation of universal suffrage, that is to say, that system by means of which the lowest natures prescribe themselves as a law for higher natures. The annihilation of mediocrity and its prevalence.
This is one of those aphorisms that are not fully developed. But even in its fragmentary form, and coupled with a handful of other aphorisms in this vein, we can suss out what Nietzsche wants. He wants laws that will make life harder. This will present a choice before the weak and mediocre. Either change your ways and go through self-surpassing that will make you stronger and able to withstand this situation, or perish and become extinct. It is never entirely clear if the lawgivers are to be actual statesmen that will make laws everyone should obey, or just cultural figures who create laws for themselves and become models that others aspire to follow, like Zarathustra on top of his mountain. In any case, he wants to redirect the course of human history towards a happier humanity. Now, hold on. Doesn't that contradict what we read earlier? How he says that there should be two spheres, one for the mediocre and one for the noble? It certainly seems so. But the contradiction is eliminated once we realize who should be the ones creating the laws.
I am writing for a race of men which does not yet exist, for the lords of the earth. In Plato's Theages the following passage will be found: every one of us would like if possible to be master of mankind, if possible, a god. This attitude of mind must be reinstated in our midst. Englishmen, Americans, and Russians.
Nietzsche makes it clear that the lawgivers, those who are to create the new values, don't exist yet. There is no one alive who he would give that authority to, and we can only hope that they will come in the future. He predicts that they will come out of the nations that still hold potential for greatness, namely the English, the Americans, and the Russians. In any way, this means that what he is talking about is not a recipe for immediate political action. What we currently should be focusing on is this.
The strong of the future. To what extent necessity on the one hand and accident on the other have attained to conditions from which a stronger species may be reared, this we are now able to understand and to bring about consciously. We can now create those conditions under which such an elevation is possible.
Right now, we maintain the two spheres, and in the noble sphere, our project is to create a stronger race of humans, those who will produce the future lawgivers. The book is meant to present the values and ideas, or at least some of them, that should be instilled in order to create that stronger race. One such idea is the eternal recurrence, and we analyzed it in the 4th video of this series. It's an idea that is designed to make you focus on the present, on living your earthly life the best way you can. Another idea is continuous self-surpassing, until we reach a place that is beyond good and evil. In the genealogy of morals, Nietzsche said that we should overthrow the idea of good and evil, That is, the idea that there is absolute good and absolute bad, but he still held on to the idea that we can say if something is good or bad for us. The ideal of the Superman goes even beyond that. A Superman is someone who has rationalized the world in such a way that they experience everything as good. If we all become Supermen, we will be able to do whatever we want, because no one will be harmed by it, as they will always experience it as good. This is the future utopia that Nietzsche envisions. So, what do I think about this idea of a future master race of stronger and happier people, who will guide humanity in a better direction, and perhaps even eliminate all mediocrity? I think no one has or ever will have the knowledge of how to create such a race. Furthermore, the idea that being stronger makes you happier is just a theory, and it doesn't give you license to try to eliminate the people you believe to be mediocre. Nietzsche, it seems, forgot the insight he put forth in The Gay Science, that we are part of the comedy of existence, and anyone who tries to shape humanity against human nature is bound to be washed away in waves of laughter. In his defense, he never published these master race ideas. They are just thoughts that he jotted down in his notebook, and it is very possible that he would have refined them before sending them to print. As they stand, however, they make it look like he was on his way to becoming the very thing that gay science Nietzsche was mocking. Furthermore, mediocrity is inevitable and necessary. Nietzsche still belonged to a time when the realm of human activity was small enough to make it possible to discern between common people and aristocratic people. Today, there are so many different spheres to our existence that it has become futile to make such distinctions. Every sphere has its own aristocracy. There are certain fields in which I am better than 99% of humanity, but in 99% of the fields I'm involved in, I am part of the herd. I am a better writer than most people, but I am writing this on a laptop, and my knowledge of how to operate this laptop isn't above average. Because of that, it is necessary to have a basic standard for operating computers, one that I can follow, and following it makes me part of the mediocre herd. In short, in order to achieve greatness in one thing, one must be mediocre in many others. If you remember that, you will not be that bothered about mediocrity. Nietzsche was also wrong about the nature of liberal society, and his belief that it is leading to the gradual dwarfing of man proved to be false. Many of the things he was advocating for have actually become more prominent within the liberal democracies. Today, we do not repress the body like we did in his Victorian times. We are also more focused on the present and on the future. Mass culture was a fairly new thing in Nietzsche's day, and it is understandable why he, and others, were repelled by it and thought that it would lead to the degradation of humanity. But mass culture begat pop culture, and pop culture created all those numerous fields we play in today. In every one of these fields, there are people who achieve greatness, and those who don't realize it, and keep holding to the notion that they represent mediocrity, are nothing but elitist snobs. Let's look at one of the most important texts of liberal thought, John Stuart Mill's On Liberty, published in 1859. Mill was a utilitarian, someone who believes actions should be judged by their usefulness for society, and received much scorn from Nietzsche. But part 3 of the book, which deals with the importance of allowing individualists the freedom to go their own way, feels at times as if it was written by Nietzsche. Mill provides several reasons why this is beneficial for society. First of all, if you allow people to develop their personality, they become happier, and the society is better when the people in it are happy. Secondly, these individualists come up with new ideas that challenge society, prevent it from stagnating, and advance it forward. He also points out, much like Nietzsche, that such people were once a danger to the rest of society and had to be restricted. But now that society has become more robust, we can set them free again and let them do their thing. Finally, he also expresses concern that mass culture has a reducing and homogenizing effect on humanity, and emphasizes how important it is that we allow exceptional people as much freedom as possible to create a counterforce against this trend. My political stance is very much like Mill's, while my personal ethics are closest to Nietzsche's, and I feel no friction between the two. I believe the 20th century proved both of them wrong on the reducing effect of mass culture on the human spirit, and my analysis of pop culture is partly aimed to show how wrong they were, and how much spiritual greatness is contained within it. In every generation there are those who repeat these criticisms of liberal society, and bemoan the way that it dwindles the human spirit, which no longer produces greatness like in the past. But lo and behold, the models that are used as examples for this past greatness are always those that their predecessors denigrated as the destroyers of the spirit. And that is why I simply can't take them seriously. True, slave morality is still around, always finding new ways to manifest itself. But on the other hand, liberal society produces people like Nietzsche, people whose influence pushes us to greatness. This maintains a balance that ensures we do not stifle the creative forces, and gives them enough freedom. We do not have that sphere of noble people that Nietzsche talked about, but instead we have many, many spheres, in which we can develop different sides of our personality and achieve all sorts of great things. If you want to be a Nietzschean, the only political system that will allow you to do so is liberal democracy.